6 confirmed planned school attacks were averted.
There was a plan, there was access potentially to weapons.
So North Carolina potentially had 6 school shootings that have been averted. I'm Sarah Ferris, true crime podcast producer.
And I'm Katherine Schweit, former head of the FBI's active shooter program.
And you're listening to Stop the Killing.
Welcome to Stop the Killing. I have a incredibly unique and cool thing that we're going to do this season. And it begins with assistant research professor from the University of Michigan, Dr. Elyse J. Welcome, Elyse.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
I'm very excited to have Elyse on because we've asked the people from the National Center for School Safety, which is based at the University of Michigan, part of this massive effort that's been underway to conduct research into why we have firearms violence in the United States, what causes it, what we can do about it, what the repercussions are, who it impacts. They do all kinds of research, and not in a little way. They're doing research in many, many ways. And the National Center itself supports schools and funding. And out of the University of Michigan is this big research component. I went to their first conference and I was just blown away by the amount of research that had already been done in the first couple of years. And so that organization, the Institute for Firearms Injury Prevention, based at the University of Michigan, but it is a national program providing research really that we've never had available to us and creating thinking situations where we get people together to say, okay, what do we need to work on next? To me, it's a pretty incredible change that we've had in terms of how we can attack the issue of dealing with nearly 50,000 people who die by firearms in the United States every year. And not just the deaths, right? But there are, 3 times more injuries, I think, on average versus a death. So, say if there's 50,000 deaths a year, there's 150,000 firearms injuries. So we're so excited to have Elyse here because she is our inaugural researcher. First of all, if you tell us a bit about your background and how you came to where you are at the University of Michigan.
So my name's Elyse J. I grew up in the beautiful state of Wyoming. I went to undergraduate at Johns Hopkins University, where I studied psychology and anthropology. I spent a few years living in Kenya and Sierra Leone working on public health projects. And during that time, I got a master's degree in global health from Duke University. And then I matriculated at the University of Michigan in health behavior, health. It used to be health education, now it's health equity, to better understand behavioral science and how kind of some of these social determinants of health and the structures in our society can inform health and well-being. And that's who I am.
Wow. Makes me wonder what I've been doing with my life.
Well, you say incredible. That, but that's not who you are because you have 2 new cats.
Oh, yeah.
Leaving out the most important thing.
I also have a dog. So I have multiple animals. My dog, she's been with me for about 8 years. Her name is Tamu. I got her when I was in Kenya. She's a little bit less excited about the cats than I am, but she's coming around. And then, of course, I'm really happy to talk a bit about the work we're doing on a very important topic that are called technology-facilitated, anonymous, confidential reporting systems. That's a mouthful. We like to call it TFERS. But these are essentially app-based, text-based, website-based tip lines that are anonymous or confidential that are implemented in K through 12 schools. So we have kind of older in terms of historical call-in lines that are state-run for schools, right? That were implemented in the late 90s. And those are meant to be anonymous, similar to Crime Stoppers, where you call in, you give some information. For the school-based tip lines, there's no reward. So that's a bit different. And unlike Crime Stoppers, it's usually not in response to a crime that's already occurred. These tip lines are intended to be prevention-based. So I will say 34 states out of the 50 in the United States have statewide implemented tip lines. That doesn't mean that every school in the state is necessarily using them, but it means that they're available. And many states have mandated that all schools have to have some sort of anonymous tip line. We think that these tip lines are probably a pretty positive thing. We don't have a ton of research on them. So despite being prevalent, we don't actually know what the evidence base is for when these can be most effective and how to leverage that effectiveness and those kind of modifiable features related to implementation, training, the design of the systems to make them more palatable, usable, and at the end of the day, efficient in preventing violence and other harm. So that's what I'm working on.
You decided to do this research, and certainly you can refer to other research. So tip lines are important. I know some people who run tip lines, and they think they're very important. But tell me how you take that curiosity, which is what I think you started with, and say, okay, we're going to look at tip lines, and then what were you hoping to find out?
So I got into researching these technology facilitate tip lines because I'm really passionate about understanding how social media can either exacerbate risk or be leveraged to reduce the risk in adolescent health. And it turns out that studying social media is really hard. You can collect kind of self-reported information, but it's very hard to collect observed interactions in the online space due to a variety of privacy laws and the laws in the United States, which are unlike the European Union in terms of how they regulate privacy and what the rights are. So I've looked for very creative ways to better understand how social media informs health and well-being. And in doing that, I started getting into the tip line work because a lot of students actually will report concerns they see on social media through these anonymous reporting systems or these confidential reporting systems, but they have to be technology facilitated in that they need to have an app, a website, or a text option in order to upload the screenshots. So that's where I kind of that's my pathway into this space. And initially, our work has been focused in partnership with one state, their Department of Education, that's the state of North Carolina. They use statewide a Sandy Hook Promise anonymous reporting system called Say Something. It's used in all public schools and charter schools in North Carolina. And North Carolina, through kind of a very fruitful collaboration, agreed to share with us the tip level data. So what students actually submit. This is super unique. There's not a lot of research out there on tip lines. Some states do provide like annual reports where they list the number of tips and what students identify as the event type when they submit the tip. But you don't get a lot of that fine-grained understanding of when are students submitting? What are the contextualizing factors? Are there gaps in terms of who's submitting, right? What is the severity of those tips and how does that change by these different factors? These are all important features to identify in order to be able to advise schools as well as responding agencies when to be most alert for these types of tips coming in. It's helpful in that tailoring. But the other question, of course, is implementation. How are these, systems rolled out and what are the trainings around them, if any? How do you get students on board? This is one thing I've noticed, and not specifically to North Carolina, but in some additional work we're doing. A lot of people don't know about these tip lines, despite the fact that they're in 34 out of 50 states. That's statewide systems, right? In every state, at least one district uses a anonymous reporting system at for their district, because there are products available that they can, purchase and use just at a district level, or they can create their own, etc. But we're thinking about these statewide systems because we think that statewide systems have the opportunity to be more equitable.
We've done lots of episodes on anonymous reporting systems from a user perspective. But what I found absolutely fascinating about your research is some of those like high level numbers of what kinds of tips are coming in. And I think it underlines exactly why everybody should have access to it. Do you want to just go through some of those slightly shocking statistics that you've pulled out in terms of who's reporting tips and what those tips are on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the paper that you're referring to, it was a preliminary study we did within this data set, and we'll be having many other studies coming out of this data set, which is great. But we were looking at firearm-related tips. So one of the challenges in this data is that when students go to submit, they basically open up their app, the website. For each system, or even at the district level, students are asked to indicate what is the quote-unquote event type they're submitting about. And it turns out these event types vary quite a bit, especially across states in terms of what states are, what those quote unquote event types students can choose from. In North Carolina, there is like a weapons related option. However, when it comes to firearm risks in schools, that could also be a mass shooting, that could be a suicide, that could be an interpersonal firearm event between two students or between a student and the community member. That could be someone you seeing a community member having a firearm outside the school and you want to let someone know. That could be knowledge of a firearm in someone's home where that student, the student who lives there is having some mental health concerns. Like there are so many different types of challenging situations where a firearm might be present and students might be reporting that we had to extract and identify which tips actually were referring to firearms. So what we did was we came up with a series of words that we know are related to firearms. And we had this kind of what we call like a mini dictionary of these terms. And we then ran that dictionary through all of the tips to identify which tips contained reference to a firearm. And what we found is that almost 10% of the tips in North Carolina between the 4 years of our study, which was 2019 through 2023, almost 10% referred to a firearm. And that's really important.
Huge.
Yeah,
like
it's
1 in 10 phone calls.
1 in 10. Right. Like, or text message, app-based reports, website reports, etc. Most kids or most youth don't call in. Like calling in is like the least popular mode.
Yeah.
So this is why, again, it's why it's really important that we have technology facilitated systems that are more than just a call in.
The other tips are things that might be things like this person is bullying somebody. I saw somebody steal something. I saw this kid cheating on his test. So there are a lot of things that might be they might be violence oriented or they might not be. But what I was going to mention before is when you say, well, you could have this kind of firearms event. My neighbor has a gun in his house and it scares me versus Johnny has a gun in his backpack, right? Very different pieces of information.
I think it provides a really awesome, important opportunity to be very specific about the types of firearm events. Mass shootings are terrible. We don't want a single mass shooting. One is too many. But 99% of youth who die from a firearm injury, that's not due to a mass shooting at schools or a mass shooting event at all. The majority of firearm injury and death is occurring in community settings or in home settings. So I actually think it's really helpful when we get different types of firearm tips because at the end of the day, we want to promote youth safety. We want to promote the opportunity to create prevention before a firearm event. That's what's very cool about these systems is that they are upstream. They're not, call in after something happened and tell us who did it. They're, hey, are you noticing something's happening that seems a little bit strange with a friend? Are you noticing that they're feeling down? Are you noticing that, they're starting to talk more about firearms and that they're starting to feel more angry and withdrawn? Like these are all warning signs. And, from some qualitative work we're doing, a point was made that these warning signs are not things you call the police about, right? Like you're not calling the police to be like, my friend feels down. That's totally irrelevant as a response. These are systems that help kind of identify early on some behaviors where we need to get more people involved to help figure out what is going on early and identify if there are opportunities to provide support in order to help that young person or that person in the community who is struggling in some way. It's also the opportunity to kind of create some distance between punitive response and to create more opportunity for kind of more of a restorative and community well-being response, I would say, in terms of identifying early on, okay, so-and-so is struggling, like, can we get them connected with additional resources way before we're calling 911 to say, oh my gosh, things happen.
I love that because that is, I hear on the other end of it, right? A shooting happens. I answer this question all the time. Well, why didn't anybody see this? It's the parents' fault. They should have done this. But the parents aren't the only ones. And the community as a whole sees individuals who are under stress. We know that those behaviors are the stresses and the behaviors that people see so often aren't reported. And that is part of the whole point about having anonymous reporting systems is that it can be one of the many tools that allows us to see things, which I love the way you put that. It's like long before law enforcement would be called.
We have this tension, right? We want more information from the person who submitted, but it's really, really, really hard to get people in general, but particularly youth, to submit because of fear of identification and the ramifications that would create within their friend group, within their school group. growing up, I can think of examples where someone quote unquote snitched and like people got mad. And that's a really de-incentivizing mechanism through which people don't want to submit. So the anonymous nature or the confidential nature is really important in these systems. However, I also can appreciate that anonymously submitted information feels almost less reliable to some responders. That's a real consideration. And so what I would say is, yes, we have this tension. There's not really a clear way to get through it. It is important to submit these tips. And what I've kind of heard anecdotally is that maybe one tip is not as reliable, but if you have a couple tips coming in, that kind of creates more of like a stronger rationale or stronger kind of base of information to be like, oh, okay, multiple people are saying this. Let's review again. So that being said, like see something, say something, and even if, it might be that you don't have all the information, you don't know if someone else is also saying it, and that is actually really helpful. Submit. Like it only can create an opportunity and more of an opportunity for someone who has more authority and more, expertise to maybe be able to get involved and help the individual who might be struggling.
I spent the first 15 years of my FBI career working as an agent on counterintelligence, counterterrorism efforts. And you learn this lesson early on when you work spy cases. When you get 2 tips about somebody coming from different areas, even though you don't know who the source is potentially, you still say 2 is not a coincidence. And that's like a lesson we learned from working spy cases years and years ago. So I'm totally with you on this, Elyse. Totally with you.
I've got a dumb question for you. Where are the tips going to? Because presumably they're going to the school, and then those teachers, no, they're not.
This is a great question. And this is actually something I'm hearing again. Transparency is critical, and yet a lot of it's missing. So in terms of who's responding, and it kind of depends on the state. In a lot of states, what's happening is that these calls or tips are going into what's known as like a triage team. There's some sort of, it's not exactly external per se, but it's not the school level. It's this team that's dedicated to 24/7 for most states, 24/7, 365. Again, not all states, but most states have that team. And their job is to, as the tips come in, to review them. For states that have the app-based system, a lot of them have the ability to have two-way communication. So if someone submits through the app, the responder can actually respond right back to them and ask them additional questions. Now, we know that sometimes students just submit, or and it's not just students who submit, but the person who's submitting hits the send button and then logs out. And even if the triage person is kind of pinging them, we don't hear back from them. That's totally fine. That's one way to use these. But in other cases, there is a back and forth, a dialogue between the person who's submitting and this person who's triaging the information. And in that case, you get an opportunity to ask for more details as needed, more clarification, etc. Then that person who's doing the triaging is responsible for identifying who that information should be sent to. In some systems, it is automatically sent to the school. But in other cases, that information can be sent to a school team, especially if it's something like bullying, for example. Like, it's not something where we need the police to respond. We probably want more contextual information from people, like including administrators, students, school counselors, who have more details. And in case they don't know, they can get involved. In case they do know, it's an additional piece of information that might be helpful if things are escalating, or something had happened in the past and then it was quiet, but something flared up again. That's helpful. So that type of information would be sent directly to the school team. In other cases, it could be something like so-and-so has a gun, or so-and-so is planning to do this, at school tomorrow. At which point we need law enforcement involved. Firearms we know the magnitude of effect is so high. We do need more technical expertise. At least within North Carolina and the way that Sandy Hook runs their program, the school team is always looped in. So in addition to the police potentially being called, you also get the school team looped in so that there's just faster coordination between all of these different branches, which is helpful, I think, in most cases. One thing that I think is really nice about the Sandy Hook model, and some other states also have this, but it's kind of state by state, is that what happens if someone on the school team is doing something problematic? You don't necessarily want them to be getting a tip about themselves, right? In terms of them to
I'd never thought of that.
We see inappropriate relationships come through. And I'm not saying that the school team members
Yeah.
who are always being the ones to not. I'm just saying, like, it is possible that there could be conflicts of interest, at which point a superintendent might be really helpful to involve. Or if the superintendent's the problem, someone else in the state would be helpful to involve. And so in that sense, there's a bit of a checks and balances opportunity in thinking about conflicts of interest. But that requires that the triage team have deep integration with your local school systems, with the superintendent office, and with usually the Department of Education at the state level. That does not happen in every state. In some
So,
states, they're sent directly to the schools, at which point students wanting to use these systems, it might be a little bit different, right? Whether your tips are sent directly to your school or whether they're sent to kind of this external triage team.
It sounds like there's so much more to learn in this space. But what I really love is when I was going through that particular research study that we talked about, is actually the stuff that you already did find out from that data collection that you had. It did say that there was 1,039 confirmed mental health interventions. And the bit that I found the most fascinating was that it included 109 saves where imminent suicide crises were averted. And I just thought, that 109, if you don't have an anonymous tip line in your community, we talk about the hurdles that we can stop people. And that seems like an anonymous reporting system in that particular incident is invaluable. But how do you know that they were saves? What sort of information did you get to prove that?
Yeah, so these are statistics that are collected by Sandy Hook. So for the saves specifically, those are cases where a tip came in upon the triage and kind of additional information gathered. It was determined that there was a significant threat to life and that the student ended up actually being hospitalized or like needing clinical involvement.
Right.
The other part of that is that there was confirmation that that information came only from the tip. There wasn't like someone else who went to an administrator or a parent who called in. Like this was explicitly due to the tip. So I think that statistic is very strong and very powerful because we do know that that's an outcome of the tip.
For sure.
We're currently working on some analyses to try to see if implementation of the tip lines do reduce the burden of youth suicide at the county level. So we're hoping to have another paper out about that in the near future. But yeah, I think what our paper shows is we found that in a roughly 4-year time period when rollout was still happening, because again, a tip line can exist, but it takes time for schools to get onboarded, especially if there's training involved, right? Like this isn't an instantaneous process. But in 4 years, we had 18,000 tips submitted. And those tips were not prank tips. That's after we cleaned out the number of prank tips or the number of test tips, et cetera. Those are real tips. But coming back to the firearms paper, for example, we found that 10% of those 18,000 tips were related to firearms. And that half of the tips related to firearms were classified as life-threatening, meaning that a trained counselor at the crisis center triaging this tip indicated that the information seemed legitimate and that it required a police response. Yeah. And so what we can infer is that students are using this for these high-risk situations and that they're submitting information that is really urgent and needing a response. So that to us kind of substantiates or at least gives, supportive evidence to what was found by the Sandy Hook Promise Foundation in terms of their internal tracking.
In case you were listening to my calculator clicking, I was fascinated by those numbers that you just said. You said 18,000 tips over 4 years, 10% of those firearm related, half of those life-threatening situations that required police intervention to save a life, potentially. 900 calls where intervention potentially saved a life. What that means is if it's 900 over that 4-year period, that means there were 225 incidents a year. And when I do the math on that, that means that there were 4 incidents a week in North Carolina where law enforcement intervened based on a tip and potentially saved a life. 4 incidents every week for 4 years.
Well, if you think that is crazy to statistics, I'm going to throw some more numbers at you that I'm going to pull out of the study because I thought this one is super freaking relevant to our show.
Please.
Yeah. So it also says in the study. 38 acts of school violence, including the recovery of weapons on school grounds, prevented. 38. But here's the one. 6 confirmed planned school attacks were averted. 6. If there was ever a reason, like, just get that damn anonymous reporting system everywhere we can.
And it's notable that what that means is that there was clear evidence. There was a plan. There was access potentially to weapons. Like, it's not just, someone reported,
Right. Yeah.
Like, law enforcement identified that's a law enforcement identified outcome. So 6 is that's huge.
And we're talking about that in one state too, aren't we? We're talking about North Carolina. Yeah, so North Carolina potentially had 6 school shootings that have been averted. I mean, that's got to give us a little bit of hope that we can do things.
Absolutely. I so agree. Last year, the FBI identified one event at a pre-K through 12th grade school that turned into an active shooter in the school. One in the entire country. But you're saying data shows us that there were 6 averted in that 4-year time period in one state.
Like, students know each other, but like, students have the most access to information about their fellow students, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to just note also a couple of things. So the most common outcome of a firearm-related tip was notification of a parent or of the parents. But if you're going to be notifying a parent and leaving it to the parent, there have to be some next steps of like, here are some resources, like, here are some opportunities, like, can we have someone checking in with them somewhat regularly, and not maybe from the school level, maybe from some sort of county or state level. And again, some states have these systems in place. Some states have the ability to create these systems. Some states are overrun and underfunded in terms of their social systems. There's a lot of variability, but what we're finding is that there are opportunities for intervention. There are notifications going out, but there has to be some sort of level of additional resources and then accountability. And I will note that, we had a mass shooting here a couple of years ago where the youth in crisis, I self-identified that they were in crisis and was indicating need for help. The parents were, in theory, aware of it. Nothing was really happening. The school was, I think, notifying the parents that things were up. Like, but it's not entirely clear yet.
He's talking about the Oxford High School shooting. I was going to say, I know. Which we've talked about a lot because I'm from Detroit. So,
so there were indications, but like, there was a lack of follow-up or accountability at some level. And so there are state policies being put in place, which I think may help. We're going to evaluate if they help. But I think we also need to be sure that, as we have anonymous report systems, we also need some additional support, and resource connections, because these tips are often somewhat vague. And it's before you can call the police usually, which is exactly what we want, right? Like, we want something that's like, if you send police out for a welfare check, well, they're not an active crisis. They're not actively, like, preparing to die by suicide. They're not actively preparing to cause interpersonal harm, but they're showing indications of concern. And right now, we don't really have that social system in place to be like, okay, they need some help, but it's not at the emergency responder level. What are their options? And leaving it to at the individual level, if someone's already in crisis, is not a solution. And so we do need some level of accountability and some level of opportunity for additional resources to be provided those to individuals who are in crisis, but are not actively engaging in that crisis behavior, or like they're pre-crisis, right?
It reminds me of how Katherine always talks about the statistics of if a child leaks information, it gets fed, 90% back to the person that leaked the information in the first place. It feels like, that going round in circles, like the calls coming from inside the house almost when you give that information back to the parent. Where, so often in these cases we've seen that part of the descent into this turmoil or this crisis situation is the environment that they're living in. And we need that circle out, one layer removed, to be hands-on.
Our behavioral experts at the Bureau found that though 92% of the school shooters leaked information, the most common thing they did with that information was to return to the individual. That's the stat that Sarah's talking about. The most common thing that was done is they went right back to the person who said, of course, I didn't mean it. I didn't talk about it. I was just kidding. I was just blowing off some steam.
You imagine that coming from your child, where you are, invested in believing the best in this human that you've brought into the world. Most people, you've got so much more bias, is what I'm saying. You've got your rose-tinted goggles on. It screams to me that it needs that extra layer of responsibility.
Yeah, and there's all sort of equity concerns and issues as well in terms of like what's going on and how it's not every parent has a ton of extra time. I mean, I don't know any parent who'd be like, I'm just swimming in free time. But I just want to read out the statistics, right? So for the outcomes, 39% of the firearm related tips, the parents were notified. And I will say this won't add up to 100% because these aren't mutually exclusive. There can be multiple outcomes, which is probably good. And we also only listed the top ones, so there were additional outcomes. But so 39% there's a notification of the parent. In 22% of the tips, there was some sort of school disciplinary action. In almost 20%, there was some sort of school non-disciplinary action. In almost 16%, there was a police welfare check. And then in 15%, there was continuing monitoring by school personnel. In less than 2% of tips were there issuance of a citation, recovery of a weapon, hospitalization, restorative practices, safety planning, and establishing a treatment plan. So again, these tips are sometimes really far upstream. Issuance of a citation, recovery of a weapon are both really basically at the active crisis, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Hospitalization at an active crisis, but restorative practices, safety planning, and establishment of a treatment plan, those are a bit more upstream. And so I'm curious to get kind of more involved with what's the difference between schools monitoring and the establishing of a safety plan. And this might speak to something you're saying, Katherine, of if a student says, oh, I was just kidding. Okay, maybe the school continues to just monitor it, but there's not safety planning around that. We're not really sure. But
I think we also struggle with a school that has one counselor that's responsible for 600 kids every year. And so that school doesn't really have the resources to monitor a kid, meet with him every week, stop by his first period class and ask him how he's doing.
Yeah.
And there are very kind of broken structures in terms of taking care of people on a whole scale basis, because we just don't have those middle support systems in schools because they don't have the funding for them.
Got a question that I don't think you're going to know the answer to, but I would like this to be the next research
way
study.
To tell her she's going to fail right there. Just tell her you're going to fail on this question, but let me just ask you.
Yeah, let me ask you anyway. So I was thinking about this and the importance of the anonymous reporting systems. Do we know how many schools that have had mass shootings had anonymous reporting systems in place and how many didn't?
I think you're giving me my next research paper.
I tell you, it's the question that's begging to be answered, is it not?
It is begging to be answered. I also want to note, again, there's a lot of heterogeneity in these systems. Not every system, we can't compare every system to one another because they're not the same thing. And so I guess my ask for your listeners, if you're still listening, thank you so much. But also investigate in your state. Are you in a state that has an anonymous reporting system at the state level? And if so, what's the structure of your system? If you have contacts with the people who have power in your state, can you help me get more data? This is a huge challenge. It's really, really hard to get data from different states to help us do some of these analyses. It would be helpful if we could get more data. But the other thing I will say is that it's not all apples, right? I don't know if this is a very American saying, but we're looking at apples, oranges, bananas, kiwis. These systems are very different. And we need to understand how the differences in these systems play into if they have efficacy, when students want to use them, how the response is happening. Because the other question sometimes is a student spits a tip and what happens to it? Is anyone responding to it? That's not entirely clear at this point either.
So
wow.
I will say, too, I think they've worked in the States pretty hard to kind of how to make a better sausage. That's another Americanism, Sarah. So Sarah loves it when you use an American phrase that doesn't make any sense to her.
Especially containing meat to a vegetarian, but carry on.
Right. That's inside baseball. So what I take away from this in part is the idea of who's involved in the anonymous tip system. And like you mentioned that there were 34 states that have an available state system. But my question to our listeners would be, call your school and ask if they're tapped into the state system. Because if your school district isn't, do it before your kid starts school next semester?
Parents are an opportunity for trusted adults, right? And not just to your own child, but to other children. I think creating spaces where the other children have a safe adult who they can turn to, even if it's not their own parent, is really important. We know that that's actually one of the most positive predictors of positive youth outcomes. So I think that's just a general thing I would say is like,
I love that.
if you're an adult and you're relatively pro-social, like trying to find opportunities to become a trusted adult. I don't have kids at this time, but I coach for a national program called Girls on the Run. And it's just an opportunity for girls to that's a misnomer in that they don't all have to be running. It's very friendly in
That's
terms
a
of
great
just,
program. It's a great
Yeah.
Girls on the Run is a great program. Thank you for doing that. That is
Well, it
such
should
a
be called,
gift.
It's so cool, but it should be called Girls on the Move. Like just moving your body is the kind of point that's and setting goals and learning those kind of pro-social activities, but just getting involved in a way where you're providing an opportunity for students and youth to, if they are having a challenge, like come to a trusted adult. I will say though, like what happens if you're told? Like it's not always clear, as an individual adult, like, well, what do you then do? Like who do you call? Well, if your school has an anonymous reporting system, you can use it too. You can submit through those systems as an adult to be like, I heard this. And what I've heard from some of my qualitative interviews, if you, for example, if you're part of the social network of your children and your children's friends in terms of their parents, and your child doesn't want something disclosed and they don't want everyone to know that their parent told, like an anonymous reporting system is an opportunity to submit some information anonymously in a way where it won't necessarily be tracked back to you and your child. And so that can be an opportunity, again, for disclosure of information if you're not comfortable or if you don't feel like you have the skills to address it directly.
So particularly what resonated with me there was being the safe adult for other kids. So I'll be taking that away today.
Yeah.
So thank you. Tell our audience if they want to dive deeper into this information, where they can find everything that you've been working on and maybe a little hint of what's to come.
Sure. Yeah. So nc2s.org.
nc2s.org. O-R-G.
Yep, they have great resources. The Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention also has information about different work we're doing in terms of faculty. We do work across a variety of spaces, including school and youth-related injury prevention, but we also do broader community work, policy work, etc. So I would encourage you to check that out. And so the Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention is firearminjury.umich.edu. Feel free to check that out. My faculty page is on there. But yeah, feel free to also Google me. I'll come up. My name is spelled uniquely enough that it's it's relatively easy to find. So
Thank you for joining us on Stop the Killing. Remember, these conversations aren't just important, they're necessary. If you're ready to dive deeper into the issues we cover, Katherine's book, Stop the Killing, and also How to Talk About Guns with Anyone are available now at katherineschweit.com. Stop the Killing is proudly produced by Sarah Ferris Media. For more award-winning podcasts like Conning the Con and Watching Two Detectives, visit sarahferrismedia.com. As an independent podcast, we rely on your support to keep these critical discussions alive. If you value our work, please consider supporting us on patreon.com/stopthekilling or by simply subscribing on Apple Podcasts now. Not only will you help us to continue this mission, but you'll also get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive content that takes a deeper look into unfolding incidents. And don't forget, Stop the Killing is a team effort. You can make a difference by leaving a review on Apple and sharing this podcast with others. Together, we can keep pushing these conversations forward. Thank you for being part of this journey. Stay safe, stay informed, and let's continue to stop the killing.